Today we are going to be looking at fractions. We're going to be answering the question, what are fractions? So, what are fractions? Fractions are parts of a whole. Let's take a look at the example 4 over 5. 4 over 5 is a fraction that can also be read as 4/5. The 4 above the bar represents the number of parts present in a whole. The 5 below the bar represents the total number of parts in a whole. The 5 represents the total number of parts there are in the whole, and the 4 represents the number of parts present in the whole 5 parts. Let's take a look at some vocabulary. The number above the bar is called the numerator. That number represents how many parts that are present in the whole. The number below the bar is called the denominator. This number represents how many parts there are total in the whole. Let's take a look at the model that we have representing this equation. We have a bar that is split into 2 parts because of the denominator, which is 2. The 2 represents that we have 2 parts total in our whole, so we've broken it into 2 parts. As you can see, only one part is shaded because that is the only part that is present in this whole. That is because we have the number 1 as our numerator and 2 as our denominator, so we know that only 1 out of 2 parts are present, which is exactly what our model represents. Now let's try figuring out what fraction the model is represented by. We can do this by counting the total number of parts that we have in the model and getting the denominator, and then figuring out how many parts are shaded to find the numerator. So let's start by counting how many parts we have total to figure out our denominator. As you can see, I've sectioned out the entire bar to figure out how many sections are present in the denominator, and then that would give us the answer of our denominator. Since we have 4 total parts, we know that 4 is our denominator, and the shaded part is our numerator. So let's figure out how many parts out of these 4 parts are shaded to find our numerator. As you can see, we only have 1 shaded part out of this whole model, out of the 4 pieces, so we know that our fraction is equal to 1/4. Now let's start figuring out what fraction this model represents. So let's start by counting the total number of pieces we have. We have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, so we know that 4 is our denominator for this fraction. Now let's start by counting how many pieces are shaded. The shaded part represents the numerator in this fraction. We have 1 shaded piece, 2 shaded pieces, and a total of 3 shaded pieces out of 4 total pieces, so we know that our fraction that this model is representing is 3/4. Now let's take a look at a more common way of representing fractions in models. A circle is split into a certain number of parts representing the denominator, and a few of those parts are shaded representing the numerator. So let's start by counting the total number of parts that we have in this circle to figure out our denominator. Let's start counting. We have a total of 8 parts in this circle, so we know that the number below the bar, which is the denominator, is 8 because we have a total of 8 parts. Now let's figure out how many of those parts are shaded to figure out the numerator. We have 1 shaded part, we have 2 shaded parts, we have 3 shaded parts, we have 4 shaded parts, and we have 5 shaded parts total. So we know that the numerator, the number above the bar, is 5. 5 parts shaded out of 8 total parts. Now let's try the same thing with a few more fractions. We have two fraction models represented on the screen here, so let's start by figuring out what fraction the first model is represented by. So let's start counting the total number of parts we have in this first model. We have 8 total parts, so we know that the denominator is equal to 8. Now let's try and figure out how many total parts are shaded. As you can see, 3 parts are shaded out of 8 parts. We have 3 parts shaded out of our total of 8 parts, so we know that the fraction here is 3/8. Now let's take a look at the next fraction we have here. Let's start by counting the total number of parts we have to figure out the denominator. We have 8 parts again in this fraction model as well as the first one, so we know that the denominator is 8. Let's figure out what the numerator is. As you can see, only one part out of this total 8 parts aren't shaded, so we know that the rest is shaded. 8 minus 1 is equal to 7, so we know that 7 is the numerator and 8 is the denominator. Let's summarize the lesson that we learned today. Today, we learned all about fractions. We answered the question, what are fractions? So what are fractions? Fractions are parts of a whole. We learned all about fractions today. We also learned what fractions are, how to identify fractions with models, and how to represent fractions with models. Hopefully this video taught you a little bit more about fractions, and we hope to see you in the next video.